Traditionalist theology is a movement of Islamic scholars who reject rationalistic Islamic theology in favor of strict textualism in interpreting the Qur'an and sunnah. The name derives from tradition in its technical sense as translation of the Arabic word hadith. It is also sometimes referred to by several other names. Adherents of traditionalist theology believe that the zahir meaning of the Qur'an and the hadith have sole authority in matters of belief and law, and that the use of rational disputation is forbidden even if it verifies the truth. They engage in a literal reading of the Qur'an, as opposed to one engaged in ta'wil. They do not attempt to conceptualize the meanings of the Qur'an rationally, and believe that the realities should be consigned to God alone. In essence, the text of the Qur'an and hadith is accepted without asking how or by laqaifa. Traditionalist theology emerged amongst scholars of hadith who eventually coalesced into a movement called al-hadith under the leadership of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. In matters of faith, they were pitted against Mu'tazilites and other theological currents, condemning many points of their doctrine as well as the rationalistic methods they used in defending them. In the 10th century, al-Ash'ari and al-Maturidi found a middle ground between Mu'tazilite rationalism and Hanbalite literalism, using the rationalistic methods championed by Mu'tazilites to defend most tenets of the traditionalist doctrine. Although the mainly Hanbali scholars who rejected this synthesis were in the minority, their emotive, narrative-based approach to faith remained influential among the urban masses in some areas, particularly in Abbasid Baghdad. While Ash'arism and Maturidism are often called the Sunni orthodoxy, traditionalist theology has thrived alongside it, laying rival claims to be the orthodox Sunni faith. In the modern era, it has had a disproportionate impact on Islamic theology, having been appropriated by Wahhabi and other traditionalist Salafi currents and spread well beyond the confines of the Hanbali school of law. Terminology. Several terms are used to refer to traditionalist theology. They are used inconsistently and some of them have been subject to criticism. The term traditionalist theology is derived from the word tradition in its technical meaning as translation of the Arabic term hadith. This term is found in a number of reference works. It has been criticized by Marshall Hodgson for its potential for confusion between the technical and common meanings of the word tradition. Oliver Leaman also cautions against misinterpreting the terms traditionalists and rationalists as implying that the former favored a irrationality, or that the latter did not use hadith. Some authors reject the use of these terms as labels for groups of scholars and prefer to speak of traditionalist and rationalist tendencies. Instead, Racha El-Emri has used traditionalist theology in a way that includes Ash'arism and Maturidism. The term traditionism has also been used in the same sense, although Binyamin Abrahamov reserves the term traditionists for scholars of hadith, distinguishing it from traditionalism as a theological current. Since the overwhelming majority of the Hanbali school of jurisprudence has adhered to traditionalist theology, some sources refer to it as Hanbali theology. However, others note that some Shafi'i scholars also belonged to this theological movement, while some Hanbalites adopted a more rationalist theology. Athari is another term that has been used for traditionalist theology. The term al-hadith theology is used by some authors in the same sense as Athari, while others restrict it to the early stages of this movement, or use it in a broader sense to denote particular enthusiasm towards hadith. Some authors refer to traditionalist theology as classical Salafism or classic Salafiyya ancestors. Henry Lord Al-Awziya has argued that, while the majority Hanbali creed was sometimes identified as Salafi in classical-era sources, using the corresponding nouns in this context is anachronistic. History. Traditionalist theology emerged toward the end of the 8th century CE amongst scholars of hadith who held the Qur'an and authentic hadith to be the only acceptable sources of law and creed. At first these scholars formed minorities within existing religious study circles, but by the early 9th century they coalesced into a separate traditionalist movement under the leadership of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. In legal matters, these traditionalists criticized the use of personal opinion common among the Hanafi jurists of Iraq as well as the reliance on living local traditions by Maliki jurists of Medina. They also rejected the use of qiyas and other methods of jurisprudence not based on literal reading of scripture. In matters of faith, traditionalists were pitted against Mutazilites and other theological currents, condemning many points of the doctrines as well as the rationalistic methods they used in defending them. Traditionalists were also characterized by their avoidance of all state patronage and by the social activism. They attempted to follow the injunction of commanding good and forbidding evil by preaching asceticism and launching vigilante attacks to break wine bottles, musical instruments and chessboards. In 833 the Caliph al-Ma'mun tried to impose Mutazilite theology on all religious scholars and instituted an inquisition which required them to accept the Mutazilite doctrine that the Quran was a created object, which implicitly made is subject to interpretation by caliphs and scholars. Ibn Hanbal led traditionalist resistance to this policy, affirming under torture that the Quran was uncreated and hence co-eternal with God. Although Mutazilism remained state doctrine until 851, the efforts to impose it only served to politicize and harden the theological controversy. The next 2 centuries saw an emergence of broad compromises in both law and creed within Sunni Islam. In jurisprudence, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i and Hanbali madhabs all gradually came to accept both the traditionalist reliance on the Quran and Hadith and the use of controlled reasoning in the form of qiyas. In theology, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari found a middle ground between Mutazilite rationalism and Hanbalite literalism, using the rationalistic methods championed by Mutazilites to defend most tenets of the traditionalist doctrine. A rival compromise between rationalism and traditionalism emerged from the work of al-Maturidi, and one of these two schools of theology was accepted by members of all Sunni madhabs, with the exception of most Hanbalite and some Shafi'i scholars, who ostensibly persisted in the rejection of kalam, although they often resorted to rationalistic arguments themselves, even while claiming to rely on the literal text of scripture. Although the scholars who rejected the Ash'ari Maturidi synthesis were in the minority, their emotive, narrative-based approach to faith remained influential among the urban masses in some areas, particularly in Baghdad. Its popularity manifested itself repeatedly from late 9th to 11th centuries, when crowds shouted down preachers who publicly expounded rationalistic theology. After Caliph al-Mutawakkil suspended the rationalist inquisition, Abbasid caliphs came to rely on an alliance with traditionalists to buttress popular support. In the early 11th century, the Caliph al-Qadir made a series of proclamations that sought to prevent public preaching of rationalistic theology. In turn, the Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk in the late 11th century encouraged Ash'ari theologians in order to counterbalance caliphal traditionalism, inviting a number of them to preach in Baghdad over the years. One such occasion led to 5 months of rioting in the city in 1077. While Ash'arism and Maturidism are often called the Sunni orthodoxy, traditionalist theology has thrived alongside it. laying rival claims to be the orthodox Sunni faith. In the modern era, it has had a disproportionate impact on Islamic theology, having been appropriated by Wahhabi and other traditionalist Salafi currents and spread well beyond the confines of the Hanbali school of law. Beliefs on the Qur'an. The atheists believe that every part of the Qur'an is uncreated. It is reported that Ahmad ibn Hanbal said, "The Qur'an is God's speech, which he expressed, it is uncreated." He who claims the opposite is a Jamite, an infidel, and he who says, "The Qur'an is God's speech," and stops the without adding uncreated, speaks even more abominably than the former. On Kalam and human reason. For atheists, the validity of human reason is severely limited, and rational proofs cannot be trusted nor relied upon in matters of belief, thus making Kalam a blameworthy innovation. Rational proofs, unless they're Quranic in origin, are considered non-existent and wholly invalid. Historically, the rejection of rational contemplation developed into a set of doctrines that were quite distinct from those of the Sunni theologians. These distinctly Athari doctrines were then propagated in the form of creedal statements. Examples of atheists who wrote books against the use of Kalam and human reason include the Hanbali Sufi, Khwaja Abdullah Ansari, and the Hanbali jurist Ibn Qudamah. Ibn Qudamah harshly rebuked theology as one of the worst of all heresies. He characterized its partisans, its theologians, as innovators and heretics who had betrayed and deviated from the simple and pious faith of the early Muslims. He writes, "The theologians are intensely hated in this world, and they will be tortured in the next. None among them will prosper, nor will he succeed in following the right direction." On the attributes of God, the atheists staunchly affirm the existence of the attributes of God and consider all of these to be equally eternal. They leave the verses of the Quran in question and the related hadith simply as they are, accepting the poetical statements just as they occurred, without applying much reason to either criticism or expansion upon them. According to atheists, the real meanings of the attributes of God should be consigned to God alone. According to this method, one should adhere to the sacred text of the Quran and believe that it is the truth, without trying to explain it through figurative explanation. Ahmad ibn Hanbal reportedly stated, "His attributes proceed from him and are his own. We do not go beyond the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet and his companions, nor do we know the hadiths, save by the acknowledgement of the Apostle and the confirmation of the Quran." Ibn Qudamah al-Maqdisi stated, "For we have no need to know the meaning which Allah intended by his attributes. No course of action is intended by them, nor is there any obligation attached to them. It is possible to believe in them without the knowledge of their intended sense." Anthropomorphism was commonly alleged against Athari scholars by the critics, including the Hanbalite scholar and theologian Ibn al-Jawzi. In some cases, Athari scholars espoused extreme anthropomorphic views, but they do not generally represent the Athari movement as a whole. On Iman, the atheists hold that Iman increases and decreases in correlation with the performance of prescribed rituals and duties, such as the 5 daily prayers. They believe that Iman resides in the heart, in the utterance of the tongue and in the action of the limbs. On division of Tawhid, though not practiced in all Athari academics, some scholars of the Athari school of divinity, such as Ibn Taymiyyah, supported the division of Tawhid into 3 classifications: Rububiyyah, Uluhiyyah and Asmaa wa Sifat. Criticism. 16th century Sunni scholar Ibn Hajar al-Haytami denounced Athari views associated with Ibn Taymiyyah.